Welcome to the PFS Network podcast. My name is Mitch, and I'll be your host for an important new series where we speak to patients, families, and clinicians about the devastating impact that post-finasteride syndrome has had on many lives. Today, we're pleased to be speaking with Mary Jennifer Payne, a young adult fiction author from Toronto. Mary has been published multiple times and won multiple awards for her work. So what is she doing on a podcast about a men's hair loss drug? Well, for the last several years, Mary and Mary's partner has been living with PFS, and she has developed a very unique perspective on the condition as she's traveled the world, speaking to patients, their families, clinicians, and researchers to research and write a book about PFS. Mary, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us. So I'll just start by talking a little bit about how you came to learn about the world of PFS, and that's unfortunately because your partner developed the condition several years ago. So before we start talking about your book, why don't you just tell us a little bit about your relationship with your partner? So how long have you been together?
We've been together just over 6 years.
When you met, did he was he different? Was he already living with PFS, or was this something that he developed after you met?
Shortly after we met. So it was difficult to really know what was happening because I didn't know him that well. But he stopped taking Propecia just shortly after we met and had a crash. And at the time, I mean, neither of us knew what was happening at all. And he had lived with side effects from the medication for many, many years. But because of the diversity of the effects, it was kind of like these threads, and you'd never thought that they were interwoven or would intersect. Um, and for a long time, neither of us had any idea what was going on. You know, uh, there were times when I brought up things like early onset dementia. We were wondering if that might be happening. But it was very evident to me that there was something very unique going on from
Right.
very shortly after the crash.
So what were some of those symptoms then? Like you've mentioned insomnia and you've mentioned
Yeah.
difficulty driving, but I guess what changed in those first few months, because it's quite a short period of time to watch someone sort of start to fall apart
Hmm.
in front of your eyes.
Absolutely. I think withdrawal from me, from kind of friends, extreme depression, the very, very um, high anxiety. But when I say insomnia, a lot of us when we think about insomnia, we think sitting there counting sheep, right? Until you're having some issues because you're stressed, whatever. But I'm talking about like not sleeping, just not sleeping or sleeping, maybe for an hour, but not getting deep sleep. So I think that that's the difference is that when we talk about insomnia with this is virtually no sleep. And I'd be very interested to see whether there is any REM sleep at all. Things that really weren't even a massive concern, but things like atrophy of skin, things like eyesight issues, GERD, really bad GERD, and that had been something that had been diagnosed during that year. Illness on and off, quite extreme, and worsening like allergies as well. Things that those kinds of things that really, in the grand scheme of things, weren't really, a consideration when everything else was happening. But I think the big thing is that you still see that person, right? And underneath this struggle, there's so much that a person is dealing with, but you can still see the glimpses. I think oftentimes PFS sufferers feel like that their old self, and I often hear people saying like they just want to be back to their old self, and I think they feel like that is completely gone because they've lost so much from their previous life, previous to the drug. And I think that that's the thing is just, seeing that that person's still there.
Yeah, I've got a lot of admiration for just what you've been able to do, and it can be such an inhumane disease where like you do lose big parts of your personality and
Mhm.
the feelings of empathy and just emotion in general, it's hard to be in a relationship from that perspective. So
There's that kind of flatness, right? Um, like it's hard when you don't, in a lot of ways, you don't, um, yeah, you don't feel those highs and lows anymore, right? And you can feel the lows, but you certainly don't, um, feel those highs. But it all kind of fell into place because, PFS came up, the foundation came up. So, that was kind of the beginning of, generally when these things occur, right, you sort of feel like you found something that seems to be, giving you answers. But in this case, because of the complexity of it and the fact that there are no treatments or cures, it's a pretty big, Pandora's box to be opening when.
but I guess like when you first do the googling about PFS, like there's no support, there's no treatment, there's no cure. How did you handle that experience, both you and your partner?
Yeah, finding out that there's no treatments and no cures and, you know, not a lot known about it, that was pretty shocking, yeah. I know certainly for a long time afterwards, I'd kind of wake up and then you kind of remember. It takes a few minutes and you remember, and it is quite shocking. And I think the other thing is, it's shocking, but, I mean, again, through my research and finding out, that, with Accutane and with SSRIs, that there are very similar things happening. These drugs and Accutane the same, right? And I'm certainly not downplaying because we know that, acne can scar and disfigure when it's severe. But the fact that these conditions, these persistent syndromes afterwards are not, well publicized and are so horrifically damaging, right? They ruin lives. So it's not just something that is a side effect, like one element of your life. I think that knowing that these are out
Mm,
there, and still prescribed, very readily, I think was shocking. Because we've all heard of thalidomide and you know what
quite,
I
yeah.
mean, and Vioxx, but thalidomide, and you kind of think, okay, that we must have learned from that, and yeah, it was quite a shock.
It's quite
Hmm.
disheartening to feel that we haven't. Um, so you decided to write a book, which is one way of dealing with the
Yeah.
experience. So where did you start then? I think you went all the way back to the beginning and how the drug was developed. If you could just give
Yeah,
us a few minutes, just sort of what where you
yeah, I
started.
did, and part of that was because there was no treatment or cure, so really felt helpless, right? And there's nothing else I could kind of do to help the situation. So that's, basically going to writing and researching was the thing that I drew on to feel like I had some sort of control over the situation or could help in some way. So yeah, I went all the way back to look at, how did this drug come about? And I discovered, it endocrinologist, a young woman at the time, by the name of Dr. Julian, Imperato McGinley, was researching about a group of young men, on the Dominican Republic, that were connected genetically, and it was a very small group, and there's also another group in Africa as well, in an area of Africa, who, you know, there was this talk of what was happening, that they were being born, and their sex, sorry, was being decided as female, based on genitalia, and they were being brought up as such until around puberty when they started to develop not, not a normal kind of like, male genitalia, but something, definitely, a penis was developing. And so they kind of called them the guavadoses, meaning penis at 12. And so she went to research them and discovered that they were missing the 5 alpha reductase enzyme, the gene for it. And basically, what was happening to them when they were getting, a surge of testosterone, from the testes, so, at puberty, they were developing somewhat of, male genitalia. And, so she also noted, because she followed these, young men throughout their lives, and did case studies, that they didn't develop acne, which is interesting when it comes to Accutane, right? And some of the overlap, and they also didn't lose their hair. So they continued to have, hair until they were older. Now, and I write about it in the book, many of their lives, they did not have lives that suddenly they, were able to make the switch, that there was, a great deal physically that was still not functional for most of them. And obviously, psychologically, it was very difficult. But her discovery was written in Science, in the journal Science, and was picked up by an executive at Merck, right, who saw the issue with hair, and that's how the drug was developed based on the fact that these young men with a genetic mutation, right, kept their hair kind of, the rest of it is still of issue. That was the beginning of it. I did reach out, you know, to Dr. Imperato McGinley, and to ask her for a comment, and in light of what is coming out about the persistent impact of this drug. I didn't expect to hear back. I didn't hear back, but I do want to make it a rounded picture, right? So I do want those voices, because
Well, it's an
Mhm.
interesting
Mhm.
history, like the drug, and why it was picked up by pharmaceuticals, in terms of the
Yeah,
cosmetic purposes. And I think, Merck's revenue, or they were about to have
yeah,
several patents
yeah.
expire at the time, and tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, so, they several of their drugs were going to their patents were going to expire, which means obviously generic could be made, and, shareholders, there hadn't been a, you know, big drug coming out from them for a while, and we know that the hair loss industry is worth billions and billions. It has done nothing but, increase.
So it's a very interesting history of how the drug has developed, and so you start to get this very broad picture of why the drug was created and how it was taken to market, and then I think you decided to then speak with men with PFS patients. How many did you speak to, or how many have you spoken to?
Um, well, there is like a huge diversity of experiences, and I've spoken to dozens and dozens and dozens of people. I mean, several people, probably about 2 dozen people that I've interviewed quite closely for the book, both families and people who are PFS sufferers, as well as researchers and doctors that are doing research both, clinically, and are seeing patients as well. I think obviously because this does cause extreme depression, and suicidal ideation. And I mean, part of that is when your entire body is under assault from this, right? And you cannot function in any way the way that you did previous to it. I think it's what sticks with me the most, first and foremost, are talking to the families who've lost loved ones. So, I mean, and in that way, I've sat with Eric Rodriguez's parents. I think, when that patient is lost, we forget that there are people whose lives have been, devastated. They have to see their, once vibrant child. First of all, they don't know what they're going through. I know that, for a long time, like, and Eric was doing very well, with his job, had moved away. Yeah,
So just
yeah.
quickly, just
Mhm.
quickly, who was Eric
Yeah, so he's
Rodriguez?
a young man from Southern California, and he had started taking Propecia in his, early 20s. He had done very well, was, the first in his family to go to university, had graduated with a very good job, had moved out of state, was doing well, was in a relationship. And, he had kind of suddenly called his parents and just said, I need to move back home for a while. Which in and of itself, is odd, but they were like, absolutely. And for a long time, for several months, he tried to hide from his parents what was happening, and they happened to hear him crying in the bathroom one night. And they could see, right? They could see the difference. They weren't sure what exactly had happened, whether it was breakup, but it became evident that it was very, very serious. And then, he said that this. this had started happening. He had started getting side effects on the drug, and he had stopped taking Propecia. And he had brain fog. He had testicular pain that was really bad. He had always been very healthy, no health issues. Had been quite athletic, and it got to the point where he tried to, and he was trying to do everything right that he used to do and love. And so he tried to play baseball, and he couldn't even he couldn't run, he couldn't keep up for a whole game, and felt like he was letting his teammates down. All of those things that, extreme depression, sexual issues, all of those things. And I think, so he was living with them, and at one point he did ask them if he could go to their boathouse. That wasn't very far from their home, but about an hour. I believe it's in Oxnard. And obviously when your child's in their 20s, you don't want to, as worried as you are, right? Keep them under lock and key. And so they said yes. And they actually, I think, they thought this was a good thing. And though they were worried, and when they hadn't heard from him, one evening, drove down and he had shot himself. And I think that that's a part of the horrifying nature of this, is that the families, again, because there's no treatment, there's no cures. They had gone to multiple doctors, and without any help, and with a great deal of uh, absolute skepticism, right? And I think that the families are trying to unravel this, at the same time seeing their child literally slip away. Sylvia and Mathieu is in France, is another person I'm in really close contact with often. And her son, same thing. He was at the London School of Economics. Extremely bright, vivacious. Had to move back home. He had gotten so bad that she said, like, even for him to be able, towards the end, to be able to articulate his thoughts was quite difficult. And he took his life as well. And again, same sort of thing. He wanted to go camping for a few days outside of Paris on his own, and took his life.
So it sounds like the family
Hmm.
experiences are the ones that you actually kind of got more out of.
Well, I don't know if I'd say I
So
got more out of it,
sorry, go
but
ahead.
I think in terms of like ones that, yeah,
In terms
trauma.
of
Yeah, and I think
experience,
like,
yeah,
I
yeah.
spoke quite a lot with Kelly Pfaff, and she was a great support for me as well. And I think what stuck with me with that story was that, you know, her husband John died without even knowing what was happening. And this was a man who had built his own, company. He was the CEO of of his company, had quit his job, quite suddenly. And for her, this is the person she'd been with since high school, right? And is suddenly a very different person, is saying that he doesn't want to live, right? And he'd never knew what had happened. And the to the people who started the foundation as well, right? Dr. Rosemary McKeady and Dr. John Santman lost their son as well. So I spoke to them about Randy. And again, it's yeah, the most heartbreaking stories, definitely. But several of these families, Kelly and Sylviane and John and Rosemary, they've gone on and truly dedicated themselves to this cause, which takes a lot.
And they were some of the worst affected as well. And when you look at those stories, I think the reason they always stand out to patients is because they're great examples of like people who had really good lives and were in some cases very successful, like John Pfaff, and very successful, and then all of a sudden, their health is completely destroyed. Um, and yeah, so it's quite, those stories are quite heartbreaking. Um, just back on patients a little bit. So, did you notice there was quite a bit of variability in the symptoms? Something that we notice is many most patients are different in some to some degree. one patient might have really bad insomnia, another doesn't. Some patients are really severely affected to the point where their lives they're basically disabled. Others are more mildly affected. They are still affected, and it is still horrible, but they are still able to you know, have physical energy, for example. That's just a very loose example. So, what did you notice from your
Yeah,
experience
no, I
there?
definitely noticed that variability. For instance, like some people will have erectile dysfunction, but they still have a libido, right? So, in that way, and then others, have no libido, but may actually, be able to function that way. I think that, and you're right about, some people are able to go on and have energy, and where some people are really debilitated. And I think I've often seen that with the insomnia. And I think that when I'm talking to people, I think the biggest and I think that that was part of with a lot of the, suicides as well, is the insomnia, and it seems to be one of the worst, if not the worst symptom, as well as the flatness of emotion, that kind of detachment, and, but I see, some people, like, ha have found, they have prostate issues, which, really kind of interestingly, they'll have an enlarged prostate when this is supposed to be used for the opposite and be quite young and be dealing with that and dealing with, some prostate cancer or frequent urination, whereas other people don't have those issues. And some people have, like you said, that are greatly impacted will have, atrophy of their genitalia, whereas others don't have those issues happening, but might have more of the psychiatric, like the depression, the anxiety, the brain fog. So we don't really know if this variability is down to the genome, right? But there is definitely, yeah, a variability. I think the people that when I look at the impact are those that, are impacted quite severely. I think the ones that are impacted quite severely are the ones that will basically say like the sexual side effects are the least of their worries, right? Because it's become survival and they are basically, disabled by this. And so they're like, really don't care about that, at all because they're fighting depression, absolute brain fog, physical deterioration that is you know quite shocking. I've talked to men who have
Yeah,
osteoporosis in their 40s, right, and have broken like femur. So things that you know you absolutely wouldn't see in someone of that age without some other disease process. And I think what Rosemary McCready said to me was that when they did do an autopsy on Randy, and he had hippocampal atrophy, which in someone in their 20s is unheard of. So yeah, there's a broad spectrum. And I think that as we find out, at least is my hope more about it, that we will see exactly why, whether that's down to the genome or what is really happening.
yeah.
I mean, the prostate, it's a whole different discussion. But for a cosmetic condition, even if this is rare, the fact that it is like when you look at the cost benefit ratio, that it just truly, we can't have things like this out there, yeah.
How frustrating was it for you to not be able to, I guess, have your partner's symptoms heard or, to be kind of ignored from a clinical perspective? And I guess how shocked were you by how underappreciated and how misunderstood the condition
Yeah, I
is?
think part of it is, because we didn't really know what was happening, we didn't approach anybody, right? We did talk about going to, like, an ADHD center, things like that, but because we didn't know what was going on, we weren't approaching people, like, about PFS. And I guess, maybe one of the blessings, that I found out the way that I did and then immediately found out about PFS is that there wasn't for us that kind of merry-go-round of going to people who were either, completely dismissive, which happens all the time, or, chalked it up to psychiatric or stress, or do you know what I mean? Those sorts of things. And I've spoken to many people, like, many people, I mean, the vast majority who, even when they go back to their treating physician who, gave it to them, say, like, there's no way this could be possible. Um, so I think in that way I was very lucky because I was doing the research, so I was able to link with, you know, parts of the medical community where it is validated. However, I think what I have seen when people have tried to approach the medical community from sufferers, is, you know, almost across the board, a dismissal of this as psychiatric. Um, sometimes when, they can't deny the physical changes, it's down to stress. And I think the implication is that it's also psychiatric, that, um,
Right. Well, it's neurological,
exactly.
right?
Yeah.
It's not
Yeah, yeah,
psychiatric
yeah.
in the
No,
sense
like, not
of
psychiatric. Yeah, like
yeah.
the neurological cognitive, like we know, with all sorts of issues with neurosteroid depletion, and so I think that part of it is, a bit of a disappointment that even, the medical community doesn't take the fact that you have a patient that has been healthy, vibrant, and then even that much happening, that there's something that obviously, especially when the vast majority of these people they don't have mental health issues in their families. They haven't had any previously. There hasn't been a trigger other than stopping this medication, right? The first people that usually PFS sufferers go back to are the dermatologists and the GPs that have given this, right? And I think by the time they get to someone, if they're lucky enough to get to someone who, does listen and, at least takes PFS as a consideration, they're quite, it's by that time it's quite a traumatic experience trying to navigate, the healthcare system.
Oh yeah, it's
And I
massively
think for
damaging.
families too, I've
It
spoken to people who, their families will Google, and unfortunately, you do have these papers coming up saying it's, a delusion. And I mean, those papers are few, and those are not the predominant literature out there, but they're the ones that come up first, right, in the search. And then, I mean, many people do have family support, but I think it's hard for families to understand as well. And it's a trauma seeing your loved ones going through this, and it's difficult when we've got those things coming up, right? Those kind of voices that are dismissing it.
well, like you said, they are. If you look up the overwhelming body of literature, all of the literature reviews that have been done in recent times, just about um, five
Yeah,
alpha
yeah,
reductase inhibitors, like they are all voicing these
absolutely.
concerns. It's
Yeah,
just touched on something there, which was supportive families. Did you find that most families of patients were supportive? You mentioned some of the environmental factors there, like when you first Google the syndrome, you find all this stuff about being delusional. So what was the general sort of feeling around how supported patients were?
again, it's quite diverse. I think for many people, their intimate relationships, I'd say probably, yeah, the vast majority ended. And some were, marriages that were quite long. No, that's not the case across the board, and I think that, that is really important because I think that a lot of, particularly the men do feel that, they're not going to be able to date again. Um, I think most of the families I've spoken to, particularly siblings, for some reason, a lot of, like, sisters and, a lot of, parents and step parents, definitely have come out and have spoken out very strongly, about PFS. So I think the vast majority, have been supportive. I think, obviously, though, again, just like the deaths from this, it's trauma when your loved one does leave, and I think it does there's an element of personality change, and I think that, emotional regulation can be impacted by this as well, and I think, I know some partners who are intimate partners who have stayed as, friends and are still very supportive, but I think sometimes is also, the looking after themselves to the best degree that they can as well with this. So I think it's the stories when you do find people who have had family who aren't supportive that do stick out, right? Because when you're dealing with this, I mean, a lot of people are losing their homes or unable to live, on their own or afraid to live on their own, right? Because they fear what they will do, quite honestly. And I think for some families, it's they're in shock as well, right? So there is a level of I think denial. You've got all of those kinds of stages of grief as well. So I think sometimes that um, evolves. But in general, I think the families, parents, siblings have been supportive, even if it took a bit of time.
Mm. Well, from my experience, like from my point of view, it took me a long time for my family to be fully supportive. I think like all of my family to be fully supportive. I think they initially just tried to chalk it up to all of these different factors and just kind of kept assuming that if we don't talk about it, I'll get better. And then I think eventually a few years ago, when I kept having crashes and things were not getting better, they eventually realized. But I've spoken to many patients, and this happened to me recently when I told my friends about what was going on with me. Is the first thing they Google again is this. The first information they find is about how this isn't real and how it's a delusional disorder. So I just wanted to stress again that it has an effect on how a family first supports their loved one.
Absolutely. And I think that the sad thing is I actually spoke recently to someone who they themselves, had heard of this and Googled it, right? And that paper came up saying that it was, a delusion, as well as, on YouTube, when you Google it, unfortunately, there was someone who had a hair loss channel who would often come up who also said it was, delusional. And then you have two, reputable physicians, hair loss physicians in Melbourne who come on and they sound very, you know, like they know their stuff on PFS and, will, say certain things about how, they get people to cut down and it's fine and it leaves your blood system within this amount of time and then you're fine. And he came upon that too. So he thought, you know, this is safe. And that's the real crime is that unfortunately, these are the first things that are coming up, and his life is now devastated.
But I think, having papers like the recent Bayless study
Yeah,
that just came out last week, having things like and we'll touch on this in a second, the
yeah,
Merck documents, which were unsealed, like having those out there has a
absolutely.
massive effect because they can really convince a family that like, hey, this is real and it's also not going away. So well, so the documents that were unsealed or what came out of the court in the US was basically that there were internal documents
Hmm.
from Merck and their clinical trials for the original clinical trials for finasteride in for hair loss in the 1990s, and they basically showed that there was a number of men and one in particular who we can confirm had
Hmm.
persistent sexual dysfunction after he had stopped taking the drug. So that was one out of, I think it was like
Yeah.
320 something. And that, Merck knew of this and they
Yes.
changed the warning label to say side effects, they go away in
Yes.
men, which was a change from the word
Yes.
all
Yeah.
men, but still implies that they go away in all
Absolutely.
men.
I
So it
spoke
was
to
a
one
very,
doctor
yeah.
who said she sat with her patient and they went through the literature very, very carefully. And she said, as far as she's a physician, as far as she could see, that meant that the side effects would cease. This is what the doctors know. I don't think that in any way that they're trying to deceive, but basically this is the same message that they're getting is that, okay, now they know that it may damage sexual function, but there's no, all of the rest of the, possibilities are not being disseminated at all. This is what they're going by, right? And this is what people are hearing. And so if they're young, right, and generally you are fine, then this is not seeming like it's going to be much of a threat.
So, what sort of or how much of a toll has this all taken on you personally? I know you've mentioned there's some stories about interviewing, families who've
Yeah.
lost sons and husbands and brothers, and how after a few years of doing this, how much of an impact
Well,
has
I
it had on
I
you?
think 'cause also, like, I've, become, quite, close friends, and I've met several, quite a few people who, are suffering from it, and I think, they often reach out, and I've had people, literally email me saying, like, "Please make sure my story gets out, I don't think I'm going to live," or who say, I believe I am going to be one of the people who takes my life." I actually had one woman, who has persistent, serious side effects, right? Sexual, neurological, the depression, actually one day emailed me and say, "I was too tired to leave to get alcohol to go with my pills because I was going to kill myself today." So, obviously, and just seeing, like, even seeing people that, I've come to know go through this, it's hard enough seeing a loved one, but then to have, know dozens and dozens of people, um, is really hard. There's one gentleman, Ryan Clark, that I know has done a video for Propecia Help, who is just such an amazing spirit. And, just hearing, you know, what he's gone through, but also what he does, for his life. Like, he still volunteers. Like, I think, yeah, I think it's really, really hard to see what people have lost in their careers, in their personal lives, for their health. A lot of people who played sports, can't play. I have another friend, in Northern England, who's in the book, and he took it Propecia at 15, Tom, and he's had, some recovery, but literally his recovery is like being able to go on the pitch and like run for 15 minutes. Do you know what I mean? And he's like in his early, late 20s, early 30s now. And that's, it is the same as having a massive traumatic accident, right? That has impacted you physically, like neurologically. Do you know what I mean? You know, to see that kind of gratitude sort of lets people know, like, when people, say, this is persistent." So when, that is, the measure of recovery that someone's having, it's extreme, and I think that it makes it really hard because you know that this is, something that never had to happen. That's part of getting the book out there, to realize, like, and it's such a small segment of the impact, right, that I'm talking about in the book, but, just so that maybe people can realize, like, the the massive impact that this is having on, the loss. I mean, the name of the book is The Lost Men. I mean, and like I said, there is a chapter, on women, on, also the trans community. This is, one of the drugs that is a staple, for you know, uh, and it's no longer called transitioning. So I'm forgetting the word, but it's given, and I think the impact is much greater than we can even imagine. And I think that is part of it, having that awareness out there, the trauma that this is causing, and the loss of potential, I think, you know
Well, is that one of the biggest takeaways then is sort of like the loss of potential? I know for there's many things that you just mentioned there that have affected me personally. Like I used to play a lot of sport, my personal relationships, all this stuff that you've spoken about. So that really just rang true with me there, the sort of loss of potential.
Yeah, and I do think that that is one of the takeaways, is the loss of potential, and that goes towards everyone who's affected, right? So it's not just the person themselves, but it's, their children, their parents, their siblings, right? But for the PFS sufferers, definitely. I mean, right now we're talking around the world about long haul COVID, right? And how debilitating that is. This is very, in aspects very similar in how debilitating it is, except that it's a wider spectrum of symptomology and impact, and yet we have so little recognition of it. So when everyone's talking about, long haul COVID, and we've got people who physically can't work, and who, neurologically have been impacted. Well, we also, and not to downplay that because that is huge, and this is also huge. I don't know how many people, but I would hazard this has impacted more people than we think, right? And like you said, because we see varying degrees of it, I think that some people just think they've developed depression, right? Or, and I think there is a huge amount of people, and I know this, from my partner and from speaking to people who are almost like acting, right? So they are acting in situations, they're remembering how they used to act, what is normal. And so if they are able to carry on, and a great deal of people who are very worried, about jobs and careers and who really struggle and put in, an enormous amount of time to just maintain what they could. I mean, there are lots of people who have not been able to do that. The flatness of emotion and that. So when you think about people not having any passion anymore for what they were once so passionate about, or not being able to, I've had people say, like I love my child, but that connection, those kind of things that are lost.
Mm. Yeah, well, I mean, I think you just touched on the number of people, and we don't know. Obviously it's rare. Obviously it's rare, but I think some of the things we spoke about today. How many people are affected, the lack of recognition. These stories. I need my story told. Like these can all be solved through speaking on it on our podcast, for example, making a video and speaking about your condition. People coming out and being the public faces for this is how that changes. Unfortunately, it's still an issue which gets obfuscated quite frequently. So until there's real people speaking, I think that's going to continue to be the case. In terms of your future, then, what's the next steps with the book? And the last question to close on, I think, is what are your hopes for the future of our
Yeah, I
condition?
think with the book, because things have been changing quite rapidly, and there are updates like the Baylor study, like you mentioned, the second part coming out. Dr. Erwig has had another study come out as well a few months prior to that. But there is quite a lot happening. So the book is forever being updated. So I think that, I'm hoping to have this first, there may be, another book. So this is sort of detailing how the drug came to be and, the early advocacy as well. So, the beginning of Propecia Help, the foundation, up until what's happening today, and trying and there is so much to it because we've got the whole side of the research and trying to unravel what is happening, also with the story. So I think my hope is that by the end of the year, unfortunately, COVID again, it was out on live submission, when everything struck. But I'm hoping by the end of the year that it will be ready. And like I said, it could be the
Oh,
first book of,
fantastic.
there could be a follow up because I think things are changing very, very rapidly. But to give, background and for people who may not have heard of this condition, right, to hopefully just bring more awareness to it as we move forward.
Absolutely.
I'll
Awesome. Well,
go.
thank you very much for speaking with us today, Mary.
Absolutely. And thank you for having me. I appreciate it very much.
Thanks for watching today's episode. Please like this video, and if you're new to our channel, subscribe and check out our other content, and stay tuned as we'll be releasing lots of new content over the coming months. You can also find us at our website, pfsnetwork.org, or on Twitter, @pfsnetwork. If you are a PFS patient or the loved one of a PFS patient, please consider donating generously to upcoming scientific research. You can learn more about our latest study and donate by heading over to our website using the link in our description below. Thanks for watching and take care.